So I guess like speaking towards this, like it's really an example of a mini movement. How do you have any advice for our audience on how to articulate a vision for something that doesn't exist? You basically saw that this has never been done before. Like, how do you get people to buy in on a grassroots level, and how can we leverage that to actually build real change?
Well, I think you've got to assume first time that there are issues out there that are motivating people and that they're not happy with the status quo. Certainly in 1960 in the United States of America, in the middle of the Cold War, there were lots of issues. And needless to say today, I mean, you talk, Bob, about young people, you don't have to turn them on with this guy in the White House. I mean, it's certainly not his intention, but I've never seen young people more motivated to get involved in active politics than I have today, because they don't like Trump at all, and they want something better. I've been teaching at Northeastern for 30 years and 25 during the winter at UCLA. Two of my UCLA kids are now members of Congress. Think about it. Yeah. Both Mexican-American, by the way. Both Mexican-American, and both terrific. But kids are really turned on. I think the thing we've got to help them understand is that it is just a question of, protesting and being unhappy. How do you then take that unhappiness and turn it into action? And it's got to begin at the grassroots in this political system of ours, which is the most open political system in the world. I mean, I didn't have to go to some party leader and get his blessing and kiss his ring or any of that kind of stuff. I mean, I and lots of other young people in those days, inspired unquestionably by a guy named Kennedy, went out and started doing what? Running for our local party committees, running for town meeting in places like Brookline, running for municipal office, getting actively involved in campaigns. And let me tell you, if you do that, you can have an impact. Now, how long you stay at it, I mean, Bob, you've been in this a long time out there banging away and stuff. But particularly now, it seems to me, we've got to help young people understand that this is a very open system. Now, they got to work, they've got to organize, but there's no holding them back. And unlike back when I was running first, it's not that we've solved all of our problems of race and ethnicity and this kind of stuff, but there are many fewer barriers to running. When I first got into public office, got into the legislature, and began thinking about possibly running for public office, a lot of people said to me, including my fellow Greek Americans, look, we love you, this, that, and the other thing, you're a great guy. A Greek can't be elected governor in Massachusetts, but at least you're kind of leading the way for our kids. Well, that was kind of interesting. I didn't want to say to them, look, I'm happy to be a leader for your kids, but I'm doing this. I'm not doing this for your kids. I'm doing it because I think I might have a shot. But the ethnic politics of the state at the time were such that the notion that a Greek American could be elected governor was kind of a far out idea. Since that time, we've elected an African American as our governor who wasn't even born in Massachusetts, came here to go to school and stayed, like so many other folks here. And I never thought there were real ethnic barriers to my running, but then I wasn't a person of color. I wasn't forced to live on the other side of the railroad tracks in Roxbury because I happened to be black. That's what faced young African Americans back as I was beginning to get involved.
And still, in so many ways,
it's still out there. Now, obviously, it's a different world. And frankly, in that sense, a much better world.
Right.
But we're still looking at issues of race and religion these days. Surprisingly, it seems to me, Bob, this white nationalism stuff, this anti-Semitism. At least I thought we'd gotten over that. But Kitty was brought up Jewish, only discovered when she was 17 that she had an Irish grandfather. And she was one of the few Jewish kids at the high school who seemed to get along with the Irish kids. At the time, she had no idea she had an Irish grandfather. But I'm not kidding you. Don't go to Brookline Village. You know?
Governor, I'd like to jump ahead just to when we'll come back to a few things, but one of the most atrocious things I ever saw that brought out that racism and fear in the United States that it seems that we keep having to face in election after election, that I feel that the other party tends to exploit, was the abominable Willie Horton attack on you. I thought, first of all, it was horrific and unfair in every possible way, but I hoped that somehow in the aftermath of that, and even as Lee Atwater ultimately apologized, that we wouldn't see things like that anymore. And yet here we are 31 years later, and we have a president who is not just running one ad, running hundreds of ads and using his position as president of the United States to intensify racial conflict. So as somebody who was grossly abused by that instinct in American politics, what are your thoughts about the continuation of that as a tactic and a
Well, first, briefly, I did a terrible job of dealing with that. You know, I made a decision, and I don't want to go on a great length about it. I made a decision I was not going to respond to the Bush attack campaign. It was just a dumb decision.
Yeah.
You can't do that. Especially,
I want to blame them for
especially,
using it.
well, but especially when the most liberal prison furlough program in America was in the Reagan-Bush prison system, where they were furloughing people up to 45 days. One of their furloughees went out and married a young, and murdered a young pregnant mother in the Southwest. Reagan himself had a furlough program in California as governor. Two of his furloughees had gone out and murdered people, and he defended the program. I never said that. Well, if you don't say that, you're not going to pretty effectively. Now, was it racist? Of course it was.
Yeah.
No question about it.
Yeah.
No question about it. But one of your responsibilities as a candidate for public office, Bob, and I have to tell you, you've been a candidate for public office, is that if somebody's going to come at you with that kind of stuff, you better have a carefully thought out plan for dealing with it.
Well, I agree, but there's a deeper issue that this goes right to the heart of the dark side of the American experience and American sentiments that are, you know, we saw them below the surface. Now they're being invited to the surface as a major force. So how do we fight that overt, deliberate racism that not only is coming from the president, but once he has launched it, it's being echoed and reinforced? You just mentioned white nationalism. So how should we approach that?
Well, the first thing you do is take it on when it's happening.
Right.
And I think a lot of people are doing that.
Yeah.
Now, this guy, Trump, keeps basically doing the same thing over and over again,
Right.
while protesting all the while that he's the least racist person in America, you know,
Right.
which is nonsense. He's had a history of racism, and it continues. We're seeing that every day, you know, telling people to go back where they came from. I think Ayanna Presley's family has been here several times more generations than the Trump family.
Yeah, I'm sure that's right.
And I don't think she had a grandfather who came over here
Right.
and was a whoremaster in the West.
Yeah.
You know, hardly a wonderful family heritage, which of course he never talks about, though he is acknowledged. But the answer to a guy like Trump is just to go out and beat him in November 2020. I'm not a big fan of impeachment. It's dead on arrival because the Senate isn't going to vote for it. I mean, what's the point of going through that, particularly when the House of Representatives in particular has lots of opportunities to do serious investigation of the kind of stuff that he's been involved in. But the answer to a guy like this is just to go out and beat him decisively and retire him from public office and get some people back in public office that can give us decent and thoughtful and what I would call consensus building policy. I mean, bringing people together. You know, it took me a while to kind of figure that out as governor. We've talked about that. But it's not difficult, especially if you're in a position of political responsibility, to ask people to join you, even if they don't think they can agree with folks that are also part of the group. And it's amazing what happens if you have political leadership that can bring folks together and sit them down and say, well, okay, we got 40 or 50 million people that don't have health insurance. How are we going to deal with this? And what you discover is that most Americans don't think it's a good idea to have 40 or 50 million people that don't have health insurance. Now, how you get there is an interesting question. Can you build consensus? Can you develop? But when public polls tell us that 93% of the American people think that working Americans and their families should have decent, affordable health care, and the vast majority of uninsured people in this country are members of working families. They're not sitting around, they're not loafing, they're not on public assistance. These are working people, no health insurance. Shouldn't be difficult to build. One of the great things about being in public office is that you're in a position to get that process going and hopefully working. And there's nothing like it, to tell you the truth, to be in a position where you can do that.
Part of the reason why we started this show is because we do see that the majority of humanity is on the same page from our perspective, but yet the media isn't necessarily covering the stories or addressing these issues or even speaking to these numbers that you were just talking about. Why do you think the media focuses more on sensationalism, short-term efforts essentially to divide us, essentially it seems like, rather than the long-term problem-solving, thought-provoking stories?
I'm not sure I can answer that question. I've got a daughter who is an important on-air figure on Colorado Public Radio in Denver. Very proud of her. She's the kind of journalist that I admire and respect. She doesn't play that kind of game, but she does terrific reporting. I've got a granddaughter who's now an investigative reporter for ABC News in Washington, just won her third Emmy. But both of them, it seems to me, have an attitude about their responsibility to be responsible journalists. Having said that, look, if it bleeds, it leads. I mean, this has been going on for a long time, Hearst didn't show up yesterday. I mean, tabloid journalism goes back a long, long way. And it's always going to be with us. But if we want to deal with that kind of stuff, then those of us who believe that there's a much better and more positive future out there have got to hone our press skills. I mean, we've got to take the press seriously. One of the things that drives people nuts who come out of the private sector and work in government is that the press just, they can't deal with it. And you can't be effective in the public sector unless you're reasonably comfortable and skilled at dealing with the press. Doesn't mean that, we're all great press folks, but you've got to expect the fact that you're going to do this and that you're going to compete when it comes to press with, shall we say, less responsible elements. And that requires, when I was a young legislator, very often on a Sunday, I'd take one of my kids, go down to the Globe, the Herald, the AP, and the UP, and drop off my releases. Why? Because it was kind of sleepy in the afternoon in these places, and if somebody came along with an interesting piece of news, you'd get a headline on Monday. There was only one other legislator who would do that, and we'd meet each other from time to time. He was one of his kids, Ray Flynn. He became mayor and I became governor. Now, it wasn't the only reason we got elected, but the effective use of the press is something you've got to train yourself to try to do. You won't win every time, but if you don't develop those skills, don't be surprised if you get overwhelmed by some of this stuff.
My parents were journalists, and so in general I had a very positive attitude towards journalists until I got burned a couple of times. So now I have an almost very positive view of journalists, but I've learned you got to be careful about that telephone call that comes out of the blue and asks you for a reaction in a split second. But one thing I'd like to point out is that Governor Dukakis has the full range of skills, an ability to talk about the bold future where we should be moving, but also, as you've heard, a real commitment to the details of politics. It's not just about big ideas. And I want to tell a quick story about how committed this gentleman is. I live in Ward 4 of Somerville, which is one of the most Democratic wards in the entire state. And in the 2014 gubernatorial election, when Martha Coakley was there, I came home one day and walked up my steps, and there was a door knocker that said, "Bob, I stopped by, please remember to vote for Martha Coakley." So this gentleman had been in my neighborhood knocking on doors to make sure that we got a big vote out of Somerville, which is a very important place in terms of the elections. I was so sorry that I wasn't there to invite you in, but even more important, I was thinking, three-time governor, nominee for president, is still walking the streets, knocking the doors. And I can tell you, there are a lot of people who don't bother to do that, who don't do it enough in their own elections, and who don't do it for other people, and yet were setting this example of paying attention to the details. So I think, as I have learned from you, in some sense, it's not that hard to jump in, and people sometimes feel, oh, I can't do it, or there's no chance I would succeed. You're saying, just jump in. You don't know what's going to happen. But he's also saying, it seems to me, those details are important. And the good news is that if you ask someone like you, you will just say, here's how you go about it. Some people, I think, get overwhelmed by the complexity. But
look, we're facing a very important presidential election. Most of us, at least we three and others, are very unhappy with this president, who didn't even get elected. Lost the popular vote by 3 million as a result of this cockamamie electoral college system of ours. It should have been abolished 200 years ago. The guy becomes president, and he was the second guy in 16 years. Bush 1 didn't win the popular vote still. But the answer, Bob, it seems to me, is to make sure that people understand that, notwithstanding all of the social media and all of this stuff, the single most important factor, the single most important thing we can do if we're serious about change is to get out on the street and knock on doors and do it effectively and well, and that's going to happen in this campaign. 50 states, 200,000 precincts, no fooling around. You know?
Do you know what you're going to be doing in this?
I'm going to do everything I can. Look, I'm with Elizabeth. I like her. You know, we worked very hard to get her elected and so forth. But I like some of the other candidates as well. I think she's doing quite well. And she's doing well, Bob, because she's staying positive. I wish I could have talked to some of the other folks that are running to say to them, especially in a multi-headed primary, don't start attacking other candidates. Because if you do, that's going to open you up to serious scrutiny about your record. And that now has happened in 2 cases. And I think it's so important that these candidates understand that. Be positive, tell people what you're going to do, and don't start whacking the other guy, because you're going to lose.
And your clips are going to show up in Republican commercials.
Of course. And the whole thing is so dumb. Just keep it positive. And that, I think, is what she's been able to do. But in terms of my own role, such as it is, I'm going to do everything I can to work with Tom Perez, the national chairman, and see if we can't make sure this is a 50-state, 200,000 precinct campaign. No more reds, blues, purples, and all that nonsense, which we bought into. I mean, if you write off half the country before it even starts, don't be surprised if you lose. And we saw in the midterm elections that Democrats can win all over the country. In Oklahoma, and Kansas has got a woman Democratic governor. It's not the first time, by the way. Kathy Sebelius was a woman Democratic governor and became Secretary of Health and Human Services.
Michigan picked up.
Texas, 60% African American and Latino. It's a red state. What is this stuff? But folks have got to be out there in those precincts, door to door, house to house, connecting with people.
Speaking to your successes here as governor of Massachusetts, it takes a lot to, as we've discussed briefly, articulate a vision for something that doesn't exist, whether it's the expansion of the Red Line, whether it's the wastewater plant at Deer Island. Those are amazing accomplishments that you under budget, under time, amazing accomplishments. What were some of your proudest achievements as governor of Massachusetts And how can we lend advice to maybe the current
Well,
administration?
Tom, in a broader sense, remember, I got elected in 1974. This state was in terrible shape economically. I mean, they were calling us the new Appalachia. Unemployment rates in the 20s in our older mill cities, where textiles and shoes were dying, and not much was replacing them. Now, we do have great strengths here, 120 colleges and universities, and so on, but it was a rough period. And I saw my job as trying to do everything I possibly could to first restore a sense of confidence in the state that we could deal with this. I mean, people were so down. Everybody was going to the Sun Belt and leaving the Frost Belt, that kind of stuff. And secondly, to see if we could come up with a way to begin, and it wasn't easy, to try to revive economically these older cities. And by the way, we're now facing a similar problem nationally. And frankly, I want to see our candidates talking a hell of a lot more about regional development and how you rebuild the economies of a West Virginia and a Kentucky and states like that. I'm not hearing this. Lots of stuff up top, and I'm all for dealing with income inequality and that kind of stuff. But how does the Democratic Party and how does our standard bearer, whoever that is, really begin to do what John Fitzgerald Kennedy did when he went into West Virginia, Kentucky, Western Pennsylvania, and said, we're going to help to bring you back, and created the Appalachian Regional Commission, and in point of fact, did. I'm not hearing enough of that, I mean, this tariff thing is crazy. This trade policy is off the wall. Tariffs? Last time we had those was back in the 30s when Congress passed something called the Smoot-Hawley Bill that almost exacerbated the Depression. And since that time, we've I think had a somewhat more sensible idea. But if we're going to compete, and by the way, 80% of the jobs that we've lost in manufacturing isn't because manufacturing has stopped in the United States. It's because of automation. It's not the Chinese. It's American companies which are doing what you would expect them to do. Invest in labor saving, cheaper, and in many ways higher quality manufacturing. You can't blame them for that. And there's no reason why we shouldn't gain from that. But I don't see us doing that. Instead, we're looking for enemies. Now it's China. I don't know who's going to be next, this kind of thing. But that's what we tried to do here. Took a while, but it seems to be working.